I remember that for years people asked Capcom to remake Resident Evil 2, and personally I was always kind of confused by it. I've never loved the idea of going back to something great and trying to tamper with it, and I think the original Resident Evil 2 is a great game, so I was never someone who wanted Capcom to try to mess with it or update it for a newer generation. I've always been in the camp of wanting to move forward and press onward and just experiment with new things. So after it was announced, I didn't pay too much attention to it, because I figured that somehow, in some way, the Resident Evil 2 remake would be a disaster. Keep in mind that the last time Capcom had touched Resident Evil 2 was with Operation Raccoon City, which, if you're not aware, was a disaster. Basically, it was an alternate history Resident Evil game that simply wasn't very good for a variety of reasons. So this was the game I thought of whenever people suggested a remake. But when the remake finally came out, it turned out that all my fears were unwarranted, because this is probably the best remake of Resident Evil 2 you could possibly hope for. To quickly sum the game up, there's a zombie outbreak in Raccoon City, and so you have to escape while fighting all kinds of monsters. I've heard people say that this Resident Evil 2 remake should serve as a blueprint for how Capcom should make Resident Evil games going forward, and I think there's some truth to that. It does so many things right. I've never found the Resident Evil games to be all that horrifying, but this game does a really good job at setting an atmosphere. For most of the game, and what I would consider to be the best parts at least, you go through the abandoned Raccoon City police station, which is kind of a mess after the zombie outbreak. In both the original and the remake, I think the police station is complete nonsense. It's full of all sorts of crazy puzzles and unicorn statues, and the in-game reason for this is that it used to be an art museum and was converted into a police station, but still, it's a little bit silly. It does make sense why they made the police station like this though, which is so that way it could become memorable and even iconic. As I mentioned, there are all kinds of wacky puzzles throughout the police station, and they make the entire area feel that much more alive and less stale. And the puzzles in this aren't even hard. Most of them are just like match up these symbols or find the proper key to open something. If you played a Resident Evil game before, then you know what I'm talking about. They're not super hard or anything, but it's a nice break from shooting zombies and monsters. Speaking of zombies and monsters, zombies aren't my favorite monster, but they're fine here. While I think zombies in of themselves are kind of boring, within the setting of a weird police station they become interesting once more. And you fight other creatures too, like lickers, which are these skinless looking monsters with huge tongues. They're one of my favorite Resident Evil monster designs actually. And of course you encounter Mr. X, who's a fedora wearing tyrant that chases you around throughout the course of the game. After going through the police station, you go through the Raccoon City sewers, which in my opinion is probably the weakest part of the game, simply because there isn't anything too interesting about them going on. You do have some giant creatures that spew out poison onto you that are pretty cool, but I feel like the sewers are just pretty typical. Whereas they took the time to think about the police station and make it interesting, it feels like they didn't put as much thought into the sewers. They're just kind of boring. But after that, you end up in a secret underground laboratory belonging to Umbrella Corporation, who's responsible for the zombie outbreak in the first place. There are some really interesting visuals here, and I really like the idea behind it, that no matter how far away from the main streets you are still affected by the outbreak. This area is pretty white and sterile, but has become disgusting and blood covered due to all the monsters and deaths in the compound. There's this area that's completely covered in plants, which is very visually interesting, and plants have taken over some of the corpses, which leads to the creation of these creatures that are like the Regenerator from Resident Evil 4. And though I don't love the sewers, I think the environments throughout this game are pretty solid. I think one thing that's important to note about this game is that this is Resident Evil's attempt at being serious. While other games were goofy and cheesy and were known for their notoriously bad voice acting, this one tries to present its story in a more respectable way. All the actors give decent performances, and while the story isn't the reason you play these Resident Evil games, it's nice that they put some effort into it. One of my favorite things about this game is that there are two campaigns, one where you play as Leon and another where you play as Claire. You can go through a lot of the same areas as both characters, but there are a couple different keys you can only find as one character or the other, meaning that you're not able to see all the rooms in the police station in one single campaign. One thing that's great about whichever campaign you play second is that right off the bat, it's more difficult than the first campaign, because the game is like, alright, you know how to play. And as was the case in the original, Leon and Claire get two different sets of weapons. Leon gets a shotgun and Claire gets a grenade launcher, for instance. So while the characters don't play dramatically different from one another, there are still a couple things that keep them from playing exactly the same. Gameplay wise, this plays more or less like every third-person shooter that's come out ever since Resident Evil 4. The gameplay is really tight and tense. The movement strikes a good balance by giving you the ability to move and shoot without giving you the ability to roll around on the ground like in Resident Evil 6. If the ability to move and shoot sounds like a weird thing to bring up, I say that because you weren't able to do it in the original. Your run feels really slow, closer to a light jog than an actual sprint, but that actually works for a lot of the smaller tight areas you go through. This is a survival horror, meaning that you're expected to be careful with your ammo and to save it when possible. Honestly, if you've played a couple Resident Evil or Silent Hill games before, then you know how this goes. The way to succeed is just to figure out which enemies you need to kill and which you need to run past. The rule is that if you have to return to an area, then you should go ahead and kill the enemies in it, but if you're only going through the area once, then it's best to just tank through any damage. Personally, whenever I play through these kinds of games, I always finish with a ton of leftover ammo, so you don't have to be super careful, but if you play this like a straightforward action game, then you might be in trouble. As a horror game, I'll be honest and say that I don't find this one all that scary. It's bloody and gory, but in my opinion, it's just not that spooky. Horror is very subjective though. If you find the thought of going through an abandoned police station to fill you with fear, then this might be the game for you. But even if you're like me and the idea doesn't scare you, I just think the game is fun. It's just well put together and is a really enjoyable experience. Now, there are some weird things about this game for sure. For instance, you fight some of the exact same bosses as both Leon and Claire, meaning that it's super unclear as to who actually killed what boss. If I remember correctly, in the original game this wasn't the case. I mean, you could run either character first or last, so things would change a little, but in this remake it just feels kind of weird, to be honest. There are also some enemies that it would have been cool to see in the remake. The giant spiders were goofy, but I like them, and the same goes for the birds in the original. But really, these are kind of minor complaints in the grand scheme of things. The fact of the matter is that this game does exactly what I thought it wouldn't be able to. It revisits Resident Evil 2 and brings it up to date for a modern audience. If you like survival horror, this is one of the best games out there, and as I've said previously, I think you can make a strong argument for this being the best Resident Evil title, even if it's probably my second or third favorite pick. I don't think this game is perfect, but like I said, I think that this is the best Resident Evil 2 remake you could have hoped for, and it's just great. I would love to see more Resident Evil games done in this style because I think they really nailed it with this one, and that's about all I have to say. Thank you for watching.